This is No Such Agency by myself, Anni, Tolvanen, and Eleanor Saitta. Buckle up, because here we go. I personally started LARPing as a teenager in late 1990s in Finland, and there is a lot to say about how LARPing was in that place, in that time. But for the scope of this talk, I'm going to mention two key aspects of that LARP environment and design paradigm. And these are now my personal opinions and not like some fancy-ass LARP design. We get to that a bit later. Or LARP theory. So first of all, immersion, eläytyminen, which I would describe as the idea or even an ideology that your enjoyment of LARPing comes primarily from the experience, from experiencing the internal emotions and thoughts of your character. And it was considered completely valid design in the 1990s in Finland to write a character who was just really into staring at trees for the whole duration of the LARP, as long as that character had this deep and complex internal life you could immerse into while you were staring at those trees. The other key design aspect was no changing any content, so only GM-generated content was allowed in LARPs. Players were expected to strictly stick to what was pre-written into the characters. There was no calibration, no workshopping, absolutely no coming up with your own plots or stories before the LARP started. Then, of course, you could build on that during runtime, but before the LARP, you have your character and the world material, and that's what you are going to stick to. Now, nowadays we can pretty safely say that both of these design ideals, immersion and no changing any content, come with some obvious drawbacks. Most LARPers want their character to have more stuff to do besides staring at trees, no matter how interesting and deep internal life a character has. And if you can't change any of the content in your character, you are kind of screwed if the content that's handed to you doesn't work out for you. About this is that I think that there's one important upside of that old school Finnish LARP design, and that the upside is about diegetic information structures and the impact of the structures on LARP design and player agency. In a traditional Finnish LARP, back in the day, if the GMs and writers and designers write, that's a big if, but let's presume that they did, they had to write everything they wanted to be part of the LARP into the LARP ahead of time. They couldn't leave it up to the players to just fill out the blanks, because the social contract prevented players from filling out the blanks. So as a player, if my character text said, there is something suspicious about X, I could be 100% certain that X was something that actually existed in the LARP, and if I went and investigated X, I would not only find X, but I would find a whole lot of other stuff that was designed around X. And this is where I personally see modern day we often think that just kind of pointing players towards X, but leaving the actual content around X open is somehow giving players agency, that players can decide what's important to their experience. However, in this talk, we are going to argue that agency in LARPs is not about leaving a lot of choices up to players. Agency is about being able to make choices that feel like they actually matter. And now I'm going to hand the stadium, this is clearly a stadium now, a microphone, something, to Eleanor Saitta, who definitely was not LARPing in Finland in the 1990s, but who has spent her professional career building and breaking systems.
Oh, sorry, I was immersing into the stadium. Anyway, so we want to talk a bit about how agency works in a LARP. Now, our goal in designing LARP and designing structures of agency in LARP is to help players make choices for their characters that will both lead to interesting play and also improve the LARP as a whole. To figure out how to do this, we're going to have to look at a few different pieces of how players communicate in games, because this turns out to be central to how players do things in games. Equifinality is the idea that it is a state when two players have a sufficiently similar understanding of what an action meant or what action actually even occurred, such that any disagreement in their internal understandings doesn't cause any problems. Like if somebody says, hello, cousin, and you say, hello, cousin back, and one of you thinks you're first cousins and one of you thinks you're second cousins, that's probably fine in most LARPs. However, if later on someone says, you know, your father, my uncle, wait, okay, now we have a problem. Now we're no longer in equifinality. Equifinality depends not just on the game material, but also on everything else the player knows about the game, about the genre conventions, about all of these other things, including their own personal real-life knowledge, right? Because if you did something that I, as a professional in whatever that something is, know was utterly ridiculous, and you think that you did the thing, and I think that you were clearly demonstrating that you wanted to fail at doing the thing, well, we now have a problem because you think the thing happened and I don't. So if the players can't adequately communicate their intent or meaning with the tools and actions that the LARP makes possible and which are accessible to them as a player, you can't have shared understanding between the players. And that means the communication which is required for play doesn't happen. This creates an escalating loop of failures over time. LARP is fundamentally a medium of communication. If the communication does not work, the LARP also does not work. So let's talk a little bit about when it matters that players have shared information about the diegetic. When is equifinality really important? So I'm going to give two examples. How many people here are familiar with Inside Hamlet? Okay. For the folks who aren't, it's a retelling of Hamlet about the communists in 1939 kind of sweeping across Europe, and the court of Denmark is the last holdout. And it's a LARP about everyone dying, and it's a LARP about kind of this fall, and it's a LARP about the inner chaos of Hamlet's mind. And you can dither, and you can always change your mind, so there's no requirement for global coherence in this game, only local coherence among specific players. You can always back out of a thing if it doesn't make sense for you. Interpretations of actions are mostly subjective, and equifinality is mostly a matter of emotional consistency between players. Are we in the same scene? Are we feeling the same thing? The coherence of the narrative world is determined by the themes and the predetermined arc of the game. Regardless of player actions, everyone is still going to die at the end. Odysseus. How many people here are familiar with Odysseus? Battlestar Galactica LARP, lots of practical effects, really, really intense. You have to go change fuses and fuse boxes to fix things. All actions should be globally coherent to the greatest degree possible and are evaluated by objective standards. Either the ship made the jump or the ship did not make the jump. Equifinality is core to the outcome of shared storylines and determines the coherence of the narrative world. So there's a much higher standard for agreement on what actions happened and what they meant. So now let's talk about how players navigate all of the information in order to actually play. There's a process called mapping, whereby you kind of fill out, okay, who's playing here? What are the characters? What's the space like? All of these kind of background details. You build out a map of the game. And this lets you answer questions like, what have other players done recently? What is my understanding of what they've done? What is the state of the world? And then you start asking questions like, so what can I do right now? What actions are available to me? What may I do? I probably can't light a fire in the middle of this auditorium right now, even if I have matches. You know, that is not an allowed action in this talk. What would I prefer to do right now? You know, what is the thing that I actually want to do? How do I do this thing? How do I do this thing so that other players understand what I've done? And then you go do a thing, and then you look at what other people do and their reactions, and you iterate. So that first one, what can I do in a LARP? That's a really useful question when we start trying to figure out why players do and don't kind of go off the rails. So we kind of know, I think, hopefully everyone has heard the idea that the most important thing on your LARP website is telling players, what are you going to do at the LARP? That if you read the website, you should know 100% what are things you are going to actually physically do at the LARP. What are the verbs of the game? What do you do? So there's a bunch of different places where verbs come from. For instance, if you have meta techniques in your LARP, those are definitely verbs, right? That is, there's a specific technique to do a thing, therefore that's definitely a verb which is available to you as a player. The physical setting, right? If there is a fireplace and some firewood and some matches, that suggests that you can light a fire, right? Like you're certainly capable of lighting a fire because the setting has provided you with the physical structure to light a fire. If there is a boffer sword, you can hit someone over the head with it. Whether or not you should, the prop implies that you can do that. You probably have a character, and you probably have some setting documents. Your character may say things like, things you can do with the LARP, break up with your lover, steal from your boss. Those are also verbs that the LARP contains. The setting may have, background information that like, oh, every year there's a ritual at this time of year in the village. Okay, holding a ritual is probably a thing that is available at the LARP. Play culture. Play culture provides a lot of verbs. If you run a Nordic LARP and you don't tell the players that they can't have sex, sex is probably a verb in your game. Do with that
Fake
what
sex,
you want.
LARP sex.
Yes,
Just
yeah.
putting it out there.
The other kind is not in-game. But play culture is part of the game, and it defines verbs that are available in the game, whether you want it to or not. The source material. If you are using Battlestar Galactica, then you have Cylons and ships, and people can be shot, and all of these other things that the IP provides as possible verbs. The genre provides things, right? If you're playing a spy game, then you can follow people, you can blackmail people, you can do these things, because they're an inherent part of the genre. And then players have off-game knowledge and skills. So I do computer security work, and if there's a computer in a game and I'm supposed to hack it, I'm going to have a bunch of preconceived ideas about what that means. Those are verbs that I bring into your game unless I've been specifically told that they don't apply here. Only verbs that are either that have meta techniques or that are directly afforded, and I'll get back to that word, by the side of the props can definitely be done. And even this presumes that the meta techniques are actually playable, which they may not be. Many verbs that are physically possible are not permitted in our games because we want them to be physically safe. Most of the time, verbs for common social interactions suggested by these other 5 categories are playable, right? The players as an ensemble or just as people have common cultural norms that say how to talk, how to hug, how to eat food, etc. So those probably work. Other actions from the last 5 categories may or may not be playable, even if as a designer you explicitly tell people to do it, right? If you say that every year the LARP has the village has a ritual, but conditions in the game make it impossible for the players to organize a ritual, then it turns out that verb wasn't actually playable. So affordances. This is a term that comes from design. An affordance is a property, typically a visual or a physical property of an object that suggests to the user that it can be interacted with in a specific way. A door frame suggests a place that you can walk through. A flat plate on a door suggests pushing. A handle suggests pulling. Because we're literate in Western architecture and also like the physical concept of space, except for Constantine, who has an excuse because he's one. We're literate in Western architecture. We can read the possibilities of a space, right? We know, okay, that's a door. I can probably walk through the door. But what if the actions don't have affordances, right? If there's a hidden door, you have to explicitly tell the user, you have to explicitly tell the player about the hidden door if they're going to reliably understand that the door is there and it's possible to go through that. Actions can have inconsistent or incoherent affordances. How many people here have walked up to a door that has both a pull handle and a push plate on it? And then, like, do you push the door or do you pull on the door, right? Now, if that's a critical, deep, emotional character interaction and I pull on the door when I'm supposed to push, this is not good play. You can have a door with a live squid on it, and then the players walk into the room and they look at the door and they run screaming in terror. This is also not a useful structure for making that verb playable. So in practice, do your players know how to use the door? Is the door there? Do they know how to use the door? Do they know who gets to use the door? Is this a door for only special people? What does it mean to open the door or close the door, right? Is that have like some symbolic meaning in the game? What happens after? If I can't predict like even a potential impact of an action, I may choose to not do it because I don't know what it's going to mean for me. What do you do if the door breaks? Are you just supposed to tell the organizers, hey, the door's stuck, can you come open it? Or is it something else, right? Do I have to, like, can I kick the door down if it won't open? All of these things are things that you need to know in order for players to be able to use the door. So in LARP, verbs are defined by player knowledge, facts about the world. For our purposes, there are two kinds of information, subjective and objective information. Subjective information is about the emotional and physical experience of the character or the player. It's about their wants and desires, like thematic resonances from actions, the personal meaning to the player of things that have happened, reactions, either character or player reactions to diegetic events. All of these things invite interaction between characters. Objective information is information that you can canonically say is right or wrong. Is this the correct solution to the puzzle, where the puzzle has an actual physical presence in the game and you can look at it and see that, no, that's wrong. Are these pieces of information the same or different? You can compare them. It has internal and reason and logic. You can think about it, you can reason about it, you can test it, you can make hypotheses and prove that this piece of information is true or false. It invites interaction with and about the world. Each of these kinds of information create different kinds of verbs. Play on subjective information centers reaction and improvisation. This requires only that everyone agree on the social or physical actions that happen during runtime, or about the objective meaning of external events. This agreement is mostly handled by non-LARP societal and emotional norms, or by direct observation by the participants. Yes, I saw that person kiss that person, therefore I can unambiguously say that this happened, unless you saw wrong. But what, like there's still uncertainty, but most of this is about the emotional weight of these things. Play on objective information centers reasoning and concrete actions. This requires that everyone agree about the structure and or the metaphysics of the world, about the causes or the logic of events, and about what specific mechanisms are available to influence or interact with that structure and logic. Objective information in LARPs is often standing in for complex systems in the world that cannot be represented in the scope of LARP, like the functioning of a modern economy and the character's position within it. We don't need the full complexity of those systems. We don't want the full complexity of those systems unless it's a LARP about being a stockbroker. And even then, Wolves of Wall Street was mostly not about how derivatives are calculated. We need the players to have a sufficient common frame of reference to reason about those systems and recognize each other's reasoning with those systems. Players don't have to make the same choices. They don't have to say, this is the best idea, and everybody agrees. That's fine. All of that disagreement still happens. But they can't be not even wrong. If a player comes up with a theory which is so incoherent, I don't recognize that as part of the same system of logic. We're no longer playing the same game. Objective verbs require a model of the world that players can understand, reason, and agree about. In other words, you can think of the model as a mini-game, right? This is the legal negotiation mini-game that lets a player triumph as a brilliant lawyer, not just because I gave a fun LARP speech and it was great and people cheered, but because they know that they made an actual rational argument in a coherent legal structure and they were right. This is the fighter piloting mini-game that makes the dogfight victory feel real. You had to use actual skill. You actually shot down the other fighter. The simulation might be rigged, right? It doesn't have to be real, but it has to be coherently interactable with in a way that gives the structural feeling of doing that thing. If you're the law-abiding bureaucrat inside a command structure kind of mini game of like memos and essays and orders and rules, and that kind of structures your whole thing, your whole life, and then you want to choose to break the law for love, knowing exactly what law you're going to break and what the consequences are and how the whole system moves around you gives a totally different kind of weight to that breaking the law. That's a different kind of, that's not just the oh, I'm gonna be a rebel. That's a like, no, there's consequences and structure to this, and it's a real break for the character. There are traps in this system though. The difference between objective and subjective information is often not clear because we're often really bad at designing information structures. If a player says in-game, as their character, I'm the richest or the strongest or the most famous person here, is that subjective or objective information? If it's meant to be objective information, does it come with affordances? Can I buy something with my riches, or can I show off my strength or fame in a meaningful manner? Or is it just about social subjective affordance, right? Yes, people are slightly deferential, et cetera, but you can't actually like do anything with those structures. It's just about the emotional feeling. If the background story of a LARP says there's a legend about a ghost that appears at this place at midnight, should you expect to encounter a ghost? Can you investigate the legend further? Is it even meaningful to investigate the legend further? Our job as designers is to build guide rails around information in order for players to know which actions, which verbs are actually meaningful based on that information. So we come to the idea of a box. A box is the container around a narrative structure in a LARP. A box defines the set of verbs that are meaningfully available with players who are engaging with that narrative structure. A functional box limits what is and is not possible within a narrative, right? In this narrative, you may not kill the king. There will be no regicide in this game. All verbs related to that are not part of the game. Okay, I know now to not think about any of those things because that's not the game we're playing. It explains how to interact with different types of information, right? I know that I have, 4 million kroner as this character, and therefore I can do these specific things, and this is how the economic minigame works. Or I just know that I can kind of lord it over people and they'll be kind of polite to me. It defines what the meaningful interactions between the character and the world are. What are the things that you can actually do? It shows the intended level of realism, right? This LARP is not a comedy. You're not going to play the courtroom scene for laughs. You're expected to have some kind of actual legal reasoning. However, we're also not expecting players to be lawyers. Please don't cite outside statutes, keep it fairly simple and approachable. Okay, that gives me something to play with. It guides players towards what play will be rewarding in the context of this structure. You have to design the entire box. You have to understand all of the verbs that are in the box. Some of those verbs are in by players. Sometimes you can tell players not to do that, sometimes you can't, but you need to understand that they're there. All verbs should come with appropriate affordances. You don't want players to bring a verb into your LARP that they can't play on. Better to tell them that you can't play with that verb. The actual player needs to be able to do all of the verbs, to do all of the things. Not you, not some ideal player who you would like to play your LARP, not the way you think it'll play out, but they have to actually do it. And remember all of the different sources that can bring LARPs in, or bring verbs in. Objective information has to be internally coherent, right? If it isn't coherent, then you can't reason about it. And then that's going to break things if you need to actually do anything with that information. If there are no objective verbs about a piece of information, it can be incoherent, if that's easier. But as soon as you need to actually do a thing with it, right? If the magic system isn't just a spooky tale around the fireplace, but you're expected to actually do some magic, then players need to know how to actually do magic and know where the limits are. The players have to have access to all the necessary information. That doesn't mean that it's in the design document. That means that they have it in their head in a way that they can remember during runtime, which is a very different situation. In order for players to make choices that matter, they have to understand what choices are available and what those choices do in the LARP. Back over to Anni.
Yes. Now for something completely different. Torture cues. How many people in this room can intuitively guess what a torture cue is in the context of LARP? That's like half the room. Nice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the LARP with any kind of torture content will generate a torture cue. A torture cue is, of course, a queue of players who want their characters to be tortured. But because torture facilitates, because the facilities and the player pool that is supposed to do this torturing usually has not been designed to handle literally every player in the LARP, a queue will form. And this tends to create bad outcomes for absolutely everyone. The characters who initially were supposed to be tortured may now be stuck in the queue, so their plots kind of suck now. The players who don't have an alibi to get tortured may feel really left out of this cool torture experience, and the torturers themselves are suddenly spending their entire LARP service-topping everyone and their grandmothers. Now it hit me a while back that the popularity of torture is actually not about the torture. It's also, it's not just about players enjoying getting beaten up. It's not about what physically happens in those scenes, but what the meaning and the outcomes of that torture are. Torture scenes are often crucially important to the character's story. They are an alibi to test the depth of your character, the character of your character, if you may. Like, do you break? Do you snitch? Do you remain like stoically silent? The choices you make during that torture scene have a dramatic impact on your character's plots and relationships. Also, in a torture scene, you are getting this intense laser-focused attention from other characters who will literally beat you up if you don't tell them about your character. So it is quite logical that many players want to have this experience, not because they want to get beaten up, but because they want to experience this intensity and the meaning and the outcomes of what it means to be tortured within the wider story of the LARP. And this led me, like this realization led me to thinking that, like, do we have other similar experiences that we design into LARPs? And like, what are those? Like, how do they work? How do we design them? And how should we design them? And I essentially realized that a torture scene is a roller coaster. It is an intense pre-designed experience within a LARP. Pre-designed in the sense that I guess that often torture can just organically happen, in the sense that some mafia group just decides that we are now just going to start torturing people who don't pay their debts, and then that's players' own idea. But that very rarely causes the torture queue to happen. The torture queue happens because you have like some torturing facility that takes in rebels or criminals or suspicious people or politically suspicious people. And that has to be pre-designed. You have to design for having that facility. Other aspects of roller coaster is that they are often facilitated by GMs or NPCs, props, tech, other players. Roller coasters create dramatic story arcs and cool scenes, and they are often perceived generally as interesting, appealing, and unique. Roller coasters are not necessarily the most important part of the LARP, and hopefully they are not the most important part of the LARP. Some roller coasters may be actively silly, or they may purely exist sort of just because. For example, you can set up karaoke equipment in a military-based rec room, and it doesn't necessarily need to mean anything super important, but maybe the players decide that this karaoke thing in the rec room is like a hugely important thing for characters, and then it becomes a bit of a roller coaster that people want to then kind of go and queue for the karaoke experience. Now, that is because the players in general tend to gravitate towards content they perceive as interesting, appealing, and unique. I don't have any research to back this up, but I would still argue that it is a relatively a believable statement. Now, hashtag not all LARPers, of course, not everyone finds the same things interesting and appealing and unique. Some players also prefer getting bored while staring at trees for the duration of the whole LARP, and like more power to those players. Still, from the designer point of view, this is a percentage game. If we zoom out from the roller coaster idea a bit, what is this mic even doing? When we design story elements into our LARPs, we usually know that during runtime, some of them end up being like absolutely amazing and awesome, and some of them may end up being less awesome. And that is only natural, not everything works out. Players bring in their own needs and wants, and stuff happens. And what we expect to happen is this. Some people will kind of leave the tree staring content because they find it boring, and then they go do something else that they find to be awesome. Not a big deal. However, this stuff scales, because in most LARPs we have a lot of different narrative boxes, narrative structures within the LARP. And when players during runtime start making decisions what they actually want to do, we end up here. And suddenly this is not looking nearly as balanced as one might hope for as a designer, mostly because the awesome content that everybody suddenly wants to participate with may not, you probably did not facilitate, like design for it to facilitate for that many players. Also, it's possible that the content that got really broken and almost nobody wanted it anymore, maybe that had like super important thematic and narrative purpose for the whole LARP. And now if only 2 miserable players are kind of pretending to play on that stuff, it's not going to carry its weight. And that is where the narrative boxes come in. If I mention again that kind of late 1990s Finland, there the idea was very simple, that we can balance the game and make sure that all of these narrative elements are represented in this LARP by just simply giving the content to the players, and then they will stick to their own box no matter what, which of course sucks if you don't want to be in that box. In modern LARPs and modern Nordic LARPs, we try to include everybody in the LARP in several of these narrative boxes. So if some of them end up not working out so well, then they still have the other content to default to and play on. However, this still doesn't solve the torture queue. And it doesn't solve the fact that if one of these boxes gets fully empty, nobody wants to play on it. If that box had a super important function in the LARP, then again, that corner of the LARP will break. So how to solve this? Traditionally, we have relied on sign-up forms and workshops, content calibration, runtime, game mastering, to figure out who wants to play what, and then giving players the possibility to negotiate. But this puts the responsibility for fixing these issues to players. For sign-ups, players don't actually have the full context of the LARP when they sign up. Like, no matter how much information you put on the website, the players can like think that they really enjoy staring at trees for the full duration of the LARP. But will they enjoy that in this particular LARP? Like, workshopping and content calibration are excellent tools, but they also come with heavy social bias. People who have a lot of social capital and who are charismatic and attractive simply have an easier time for negotiating the kind of experience that they would like to have. And even runtime game mastering requires players to proactively seek out game masters and tell them, hey, that this thing is wrong, my game's not working out, can you please help me fix it? My very impolite opinion is that we often force players to use workshops and calibration to fix issues that should have been foreseen and fixed already while designing the LARP. We also use player preferences expressed at the sign-up as an excuse to cast people to boring and stagnant roles because those players were interested in some of the content that comes with those boring and stagnant characters. As in that this player told us that they just want to stare at trees, so we just put them in the tree staring faction over there. We have LARPs where some players get to fly a spaceship, while other players in the same LARP get to sit in committee meetings. We have LARPs where some players get to go on exciting treasure hunting recon missions, and some other players get to stay behind, like we are now making sure that the orcs don't attack to this fort, which everybody knows won't happen. We design characters that we know are going to be put through really intensely dramatic life and death situations, like, for example, torture. And then we design other characters whose main function is to take care somehow or facilitate for these other characters who have these intense experiences. So in essence, we are creating these specific facilitated roller coasters or mini games to this set of players, while this other set of players' experience is often dependent on how those mini games or that other content plays out. And while the idea behind and the narrative contrast between these to character groups may be completely logical for the story as a whole. Living stories through other players when you can't meaningfully interact with the story otherwise is bad design. If you see that space pilots have the coolest content and you are stuck in committee meetings, you don't freaking care how awesome story about the perils of the space travel the LARP is telling. You can't, if you can't personally interact with the space bit of the spaceship LARP, you may feel really disappointed and left out. Which brings me to my pet peeve excuse for why we allow ourselves to design LARPs with this kind of content imbalance. It is not logically believable or realistic for everyone to get tortured or join the revolution or be in a secret society and do cool illegal things. As a designer, it's very easy to think that all sides of a story are equally important. And yes, technically speaking, it is important, like if the story is like if the LARP is about revolution, it's important that some characters want to join the revolution, and it's important that some characters want to oppose the revolution, because that's your core conflict in the LARP. And we may even have, and usually have, players who initially have said that I would love to play the oppressive status quo character who opposes any kind of revolution. However, does your revolution come with a roller coaster? And does your oppressive status quo regime come with a roller coaster? Because even without realizing it, we often use these kinds of dramatic tensions between character groups, like how we write them and design them. We end up building a revolutionary group who gets to get tortured, and they have this own secret society clique thing going on. They get to do cool illegal things because they are the rebels. They may have access to secluded areas. They do dangerous, important missions. And at the same time, the status quo characters get to manage the torture queue, and they can sort of go to their Illuminati meeting, looking really important. And they get to sit in those corporate meetings and talk about politics and how we are so ruling the world right now. In this scenario, we are so in love with the story of a revolution or space travel or whatever the equivalent is, that we don't necessarily notice that one side of that story produces really exciting and dynamic play, but the other sides of that story may actually be somewhat boring to play in comparison. And this can't be solved merely by lifting our hands up and going, these players said that they wanted to stare at the trees. It's not my fault they suddenly decided to chop down all the trees and build their own spaceship, which broke the LARP. Like, that's on the players. It is not, because most LARPers enjoy stories that come with meaningful change. Fucking hell. Most LARPers enjoy stories that come with meaningful change and transformation. And this is no matter what they tell you before the LARP. I probably most of you have been in a LARP where there is some sort of status quo. Maybe they are the police or the military or the corporate overlords. How big percentage of those characters end up by the end of the LARP having joined the rebels or having stopped being a cop? It's a huge percentage. This just happens systematically over and over again. So most players tend to steer towards that experience. And this, of course, creates an obvious design challenge, as many archetype narrative structures rely on some people or factions staying conservative and creating blockers for progress, while others want to drive for change. And in books and in movies, this contrast works really well, because we don't have to care about whether the gray, boring bureaucrats in the book or in the movie, whether they are getting bored. It doesn't matter, it's a book. But we do need to care about that in a LARP. And when players get bored, and they don't have access to areas of the LARP that they might be interested in, they'll start coming up with their own content. in addition to chopping down all the trees and building their own spaceship, stuff like LARP democracy may end up happening. Because another truth that is universally acknowledged is that someone in a medieval fantasy society will invent democracy by the third day of the LARP. And while traditionally we have pinned this phenomenon on us Nordicans just really loving our social democracy, which probably has an inch of truth to it, I would argue that this happens also because democracy redistributes agency. And it is doing it within a frame, within a narrative box that is intuitively understandable to every player in the LARP. So the next time a group of players invents democracy in the LARP you personally design, perhaps don't blame those players for being boring and doing the LARP democracy thing. Think about where you failed at making other options accessible, understandable, and playable. So how do we actually solve this? First of all, identify your narrative boxes and rank their importance. What kind of narrative structures exist in this LARP? How do those boxes relate to each other? Are there boxes that are crucial to the LARP's stories and themes? As in, here is a box that if it collapses and players just stop playing on it, this LARP will collapse with it. Do all players have access to boxes that are crucial to the stories and themes? Because again, if the LARP is about, say, space travel, and you have some character groups that are engaged with actions that they could be engaged with in any other kind of a LARP, then you have failed at something, or at least then you are not giving those players the story of space travel. Maybe they have the story of filling out Excel sheets. Identify your roller coasters. What are the intense pre-designed experiences with all the cool props and game master facilitation and tons of design work? Do all players have access to at least some roller coasters, if roller coasters exist in your LARP? Is there a roller coaster that players might steer towards for off-game reasons? As in that you put something in the LARP that's just really cool and everybody wants to interact with it. What will it do the dynamics of the LARP if players are likely to want to if there's a red button and something happens when you poke the button, it's very likely that the very big percentage of players will then I would want to come up with an in-game reason to go and just avoid static character stories. Even if a player says in advance that they are happy to just stare at trees for the whole LARP, for the love of gods, do not believe the player. Unless it's a LARP where everybody stares at trees. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't give them the opportunity to stare at trees for the whole LARP, but maybe give them other narrative boxes to explore if they want to, and then they can still choose to stare at the trees. And also about static characters, it is really, really, really boring and gets old really, really fast to be the character whose job and function in the LARP is to pretty much just say no to everything and everyone. And we'd write a lot of these characters in LARPs. The person who's supposed to be the blocker of other stuff happening. And it might be initially fun and cool, but it stops being cool to be the person who has to do that. And also then as a player realizing that, okay, but if I start saying yes, if I'm the guardian of the secret room, and then I just let everybody to get in, what am I doing to the LARP as a whole? You don't want to put that responsibility on a player. Design for failure. If your tree-staring faction decides to indeed chop down all the trees and build a spaceship, what other parts of your LARP stop functioning? Good design accepts that some parts of the LARP are going to fail, and that is okay. It is okay if the other narrative boxes in the LARP, or in the design, are robust enough to carry the whole LARP, even if 1 or 2 boxes here and there just collapse. And for the last bit, do not rely on the story alone. You can write the most beautiful and believable and heartbreaking story about the character whose life mission is to fill out Excel sheets on a spaceship. But that is simply not enough if that story doesn't come with appropriate verbs and affordances. Players won't care how good the story is if they can't do coherent and concrete and interesting things with the story that you write them. And this brings us back to designing the entire box. You must understand all the verbs in the narrative box. All the verbs must come with appropriate affordances. The actual player must be able to do the things. Objective information about the LARP and about the world we are playing in must be internally coherent. Players must have access to all necessary information. And this is because agency is about the ability to make choices that matter. And in order to do that, players need to understand which choices are available and what those choices mean in the context of the LARP. So our goal as designers is to help players to make choices for their characters that will lead to interesting play and improve the LARP as a whole. Thank you.